This conference will now be recorded.
So today joining us in the Virtual Visitor Center is Bruce Lynn. Bruce and I have been friends and colleagues for over 20 years. We've worked together in several historical museums and organizations. Bruce is going on his 15th year as the director of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. They run the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point. And looking forward to learning more about whalebacks from Bruce. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michelle, very much. Thanks for the invitation to come and speak to your group today. And I do see some familiar names, so welcome everybody to the program. And the program I'm going to do today, as Michelle pointed out, I'm really focusing on two whaleback vessels, and we'll talk about those as we go along here. We did have a little bit of our own technical problem this morning trying to get this program ready. So Michelle's going to be forwarding the slides for us as we go through the program. So bear with us. There's only about 400 slides here, so we should be able to. I'm joking. Actually, there's only probably about 75 slides, but hopefully, Michelle, you can hear me okay, and we'll just forward our way through these as we go. And the way I'm going to do this program, this is typical of a lot of programs that I do. I speak about the museum and what we do up at Whitefish Point, and also in Sault Ste. Marie, where we have a location as well, right next to the Sioux Locks Visitor Center, the old Weather Bureau building. And I'll talk a little bit about the museum and our operations and certain things that we do that not everybody's completely familiar with, shipwreck hunting being really the primary one. And then we'll talk a little bit about the whalebacks themselves, and then I'll use these two examples, both Barge 129, which was a whaleback that we located practically in the middle of Lake Superior, and we found it in late summer. Actually, it was probably September 2021 that we located this one. And your camera crashed. Is that for me? I actually just turned the camera off here, but in any case, yeah. So we'll keep moving ahead. But yeah, we found barge 129 late or actually late summer, September, and 2021. We've actually had a great amount of luck uh, as far as discovering shipwrecks in the last 3 years. We found 13 shipwrecks. That's really, really unusual. We would go years without finding anything. And then here comes 2021. We're all in the pandemic, and we're finding shipwrecks like there's no tomorrow. So there are a variety of factors that led to that I'll talk about as the program goes along. But let's just jump right into it here. Michelle, if you want to hit the next slide here. Um, I can't assume that everybody has been to Whitefish Point and the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, so we will talk about that. We are located at Whitefish Point. That's the museum itself. It's part of a National Historic Site that's up there at Whitefish Point. That building you see, what we call the main museum gallery in this image, that was built in the mid 1980s. So it's one of the newer construction buildings that we have at Whitefish Point. And this is where people come to learn more about a variety of shipwrecks. And those shipwrecks primarily in the eastern part of Lake Superior. But we do have exhibits and panels related to such shipwrecks as the Daniel J. Morrell, that sank in 1966 in northern Lake Huron, or just a number of other shipwrecks as well. The Morrell is one that we have a new exhibit that we opened up in 2021, which has been temporarily closed. We're just getting ready to open that up again next year, including the building itself. But let's hit the next slide here, Michelle. And sometimes people will ask us why shipwreck museum at a place like Whitefish Point. Well, if you look at this map, look at the far right. I don't know if you can see my cursor on there. You see Whitefish Point at the very far right. There we go. Michelle, if you want to run your cursor going all the way to Grand Island and the Pictured Rocks National Lake Shore, just run along that shoreline. If you include Whitefish Bay, and you see where Michelle's cursor is going, there's roughly 200 shipwrecks right in that vicinity. So that 80-mile stretch going from Whitefish Point to kind of that western end of the Pictured Rocks National Lake Shore and Grand Island, kind of bookending it there, And if you include Whitefish Bay, as I was saying, there's about 200 shipwrecks right in this area. Now, if you were all sitting in front of me and we were, let's say, inside the visitor center, I would ask for a show of hands, can anybody tell me why? Why do we have so many shipwrecks in the area? Well, the weather is obviously a huge part of it. And the weather, there's really nothing. And think of our prevailing winds and the storms most often, not always, but most often blowing in out of the northwest. They have the whole expanse, for the most part, of Lake Superior to that those storms have that expanse to build up energy. And those storms will very often, not always in November, but very often in November, will pound that shoreline, that stretch. There's really not much on that shoreline either. You could go from Whitefish Point out to the old Vermilion Life Saving Station. It's about 12 miles due west of Whitefish Point. You could walk along that shoreline. You might see half a dozen cabins the whole way. Most of those would be clustered closer to Whitefish Point. There's nothing there. It's not a whole lot different than it was back in the 1880s or the 1920s or so on, when so many of these ships were getting into trouble. There's also something else that when you look at that shoreline that's missing, is there are no real harbors of refuge in there. Grand Marais, if a ship was lucky to sneak in there, especially if it was a severe storm, they would be lucky with how narrow that entrance is to that harbor. Or Grand Island. If they could get in behind Grand Island and get between Munising and Grand Island, they would be pretty safe. But beyond those two areas, there's just not a lot of hiding areas for these ships. So back in the day, they would tend to run right along that shoreline. And I think most of us probably are aware of how quickly the weather can change on the Great Lakes. Obviously, a big reason why there are so many shipwrecks, but a ship could be caught out along that shoreline and often driven ashore. That was pretty common. For some of these ships to be driven right into the shoreline. There were 4 life-saving stations that were constructed right along that shoreline in the mid-1870s just for that purpose alone. So the weather, the lack of harbors in this area, fog would make trouble for these wrecks. Collision was a big problem. Human error, something that we can never discount, caused a lot of problems too. You could have collisions that in broad daylight, you could have misinterpreted signals, and one ship might cross in front of the other. They would collide, and you'd have one, if not both, going to the bottom of the lake. Both of the instances of the whalebacks that I'm going to talk about today were products of collision. They were shipwrecks as a result of collision, and very different circumstances, and we'll get into that. But again, collision, another reason for so many shipwrecks. And really, the thing we have to keep in mind is there was so much more ship traffic back in the day compared to what we have now. I am sitting at the old Weather Bureau building in my office right now. I'm looking out over the locks. We see a few ships coming through this time of the year, kind of like Michelle, her office. She can see the ships coming through too. Nothing like you would have seen if this were the turn of the last century with all the ship traffic that would be pouring through. So all those factors combined to have roughly 200 shipwrecks right along this coastline and in Whitefish Bay. There's one that everybody knows about, and it's because of a great Canadian folk singer by the name of Gordon Lightfoot. Let's hit the next slide here, Michelle. And we're closing in on the 49th anniversary. I was afraid this was going to happen. So because we have to use my PowerPoint, Michelle, this will cause a little bit of headache for us because there's actually 3 images in this slide. We can only see the last one here, but you can see it's the Edmund Fitzgerald. That's the one shipwreck that everybody thinks about, at least from our experience at Whitefish Point. There may be statistically 6,000 shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. There may be 10,000, depending on which statistics you adhere to. But the Edmund Fitzgerald really is the one that most people, particularly the public that isn't as tuned into this history as everybody on this for this particular program, or everybody who's signed in. All of us, I'm sure, are aware of the Fitzgerald. It sank 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. It's in Canadian waters. It's protected by the Ontario Heritage Act at this point. And November 10th is when it sank. So on Sunday is the 49th anniversary of the sinking of the Fitzgerald. We do have a memorial service Michelle and I talked about this a little bit earlier today. We have a memorial service dedicated to the Fitzgerald. It's primarily for the surviving family members. So it is a closed event. It has been for the last 5 years. We do have this for the Fitzgerald family members and people that were connected to the ship itself. Believe it or not, we have a number of ex-crew that served on the ship itself. We have individuals that were good friends of the crew, the 29-man crew that perished, on November 10th, 1975. So we do have a lot of people that are connected to the ship, or they had a loved one that was on board when it sank, and that tends to be who comes to that memorial that we do in person. Now, with that being said, and this is a bit of a sidebar, but if anybody would be interested in watching that event, we do live stream the event. Michelle is going to share our link. It's not necessarily the link for the live stream, but more of our web address, because in the next couple of days, we'll get that link onto our website. It's shipwreckmuseum.com. And so if you wanted to tune in, you could watch that. So it's going to be Sunday night at 7 p.m. But with that being said, the Fitzgerald is the most famous of these wrecks in this area. And to this day, no one really knows why the Fitzgerald sank. There's a lot of theories. There's a lot of books that are out there. There's a lot of documentaries. People know about the Fitzgerald. They've really never heard of the Sagamore. They've not heard of Barge 129. If you are someone who studies maritime history, and particularly if you have an interest in the whalebacks, you'll know about them. But by and large, the general public doesn't know about these vessels. And this gives us a good opportunity at the museum to interpret that history and make that awareness or help with people's awareness of different types of vessels like the whalebacks. There, Michelle just put the link for our website there. So, all right, Michelle, let's shift gears. We'll go on to the next slide. And at Whitefish Point, it isn't just shipwreck history that we interpret. And there you go. So we just kind of give you an idea of some of the other types of history that we interpret. And again, these are going to be kind of compressed a little bit because typically there'll be multiple images in some of these slides that we won't be able to see. But lighthouse service history is a big one. That's the thing that everybody notices when they drive up to Whitefish Point. When you're pulling into the parking lot, we actually have a brand new parking lot as of last year, which hopefully helps people kind of navigate their way in a little more easily. But the tower, this 1861 iron pile lighthouse tower, is the first thing that you notice as you're pulling up. I don't know if you caught, I said 1861. So this is still an operating lighthouse. It was built when Abraham Lincoln was sitting president of the United States. He wasn't the president that actually signed any documentation to have it constructed. That was his predecessor, Buchanan. But it helps put it in context that when the Civil War, the United States Civil War was starting, they were building this particular lighthouse at Whitefish Point. This is the second. The first was built in the late 1840s, and that's a part of the history that we interpret through the family that you see in that upper left-hand image. That's Robert Carlson. You see on the far right his wife, Anna Carlson, their grandchildren. Between them, that's Bertha, just on his right, and then Bobby just next to Anna. The Carlson family, they were up there for 28 years straight. You know, when we have visitors at Whitefish Point, I always like to ask people, can you imagine living at a place like Whitefish Point for nearly 30 years, year round? That's home. And, people today think it's kind of remote up there. Well, it's not remote at all compared to what it would have been like when the Carlson family was there. So it's through their memories that we interpret that history. They were there longer, that family, than any other lighthouse keeper family. And the granddaughter, Bertha, that you see in that picture, she died not that many years ago, and she spent the first 21 years of her life growing up at Whitefish Point. So it's really through her memories and her memories of what it was like to be at Whitefish Point that we interpret that history. So today you can tour the keeper's quarters. It is still an active lighthouse, so the Coast Guard isn't too excited about us taking people up for tower climbs like we did for a few years. We've kind of gotten away from doing that now. It's a little dangerous sometimes getting up into that tower. So today you can tour I'll step that back. You can't today. We're actually closed. We're a seasonal business. We're open May 1st through October 31st. But when we're open, you can tour the keeper's quarters and get a better idea of what it was like to be a lighthouse keeper at Whitefish Point. Michelle, if you want to hit the next slide. Other areas of history that we interpret as well. the United States Life Saving Service, and then of course the Coast Guard rescue stations that were up at Whitefish Point, or rescue station. There was a lifeboat station that was up there. At least for the U.S. history, when we look at life saving on the Great Lakes, the Life Saving Service to me is kind of a forgotten chapter of maritime history in the U.S. I can't speak to maybe the stations that would have been on the Canadian side. I know there's a greater awareness if you go to England, the Royal, I want to say, National Lifeboat Institution. I think there's much greater awareness of that chapter of maritime history over there than what we might have here. Everybody thinks in terms of the Coast Guard, and the Life Saving Service is in essence, was the Coast Guard before the Coast Guard existed. But it is part of that general Coast Guard history. But when we have people coming to Whitefish Point, or if I go out and do programs and I could have 75 people in front of me and I ask, well, how many of you are familiar with the United States Life Saving Service? If I have 75 people in front of me, I'll be lucky if I get 5 hands going up, even if it's a group that's somewhat familiar with maritime history in the United States, not just the Great Lakes. But that picture you could see, again, we've got these all compressed together, but the picture on the left in the foreground, that's the Vermilion Station. I referenced that a little while ago. That's about 12 miles due west of Whitefish Point. That structure that you see that group standing in front of, that building still exists. It's the last of its kind. It was built in 1876. That station was operational by 1877. That's a Lake Superior type station house. There's only one left, and that's it, Vermilion. So there is a small nonprofit that is working, that I'm a part of, that's working on saving that original structure. It's a fascinating history. If you look at the picture on the right, you can see them launching a B.B. McClellan surf boat. There you can see the keeper at the stern of the boat. You can see a lookout tower behind him and the crew. They've got their summer weight uniforms on. They would take these surf boats out, and they would train once a week in these. They had a lot of time to train out there at Vermilion. Like some of these other remote stations or even light stations, there was nothing else to do out there. And so training was what really helped maintain their morale. There just wasn't a whole lot else to do. And so that you can see the station house in the back, you can see the surf boat there, and the lookout tower. I think somebody might need to mute there. We're getting some background noise here. But in any case, those are different parts of history that we interpret as well. Let's hit the next one, Michelle. There we go. So, interpretation can take on a lot of different forms. It can be everything from that historical interpreter or tour guide, if you would want to call them that, docent, what have you. They can tell you about the history of a building as you come through it. They can tell you about the people that lived there. There's all kinds of different methodologies for interpretation, but part of it also can be the restoration, I should say, of either the built environment. And you see the picture on the left. That's a motor lifeboat house that we brought back in 2013 that had been sold off by the Coast Guard. So that lifeboat station was built up at Whitefish Point in 1923 and through the early to mid 50s, when it was actually considered redundant at that point. Shipboard technology was changing. The ships were getting bigger. They were big steel vessels that could often work their way right through a storm. So there just weren't as many shipwrecks. That's not to say that there weren't any, because obviously in 1975 we had the Fitzgerald, which was a massive 729-foot ship that disappeared so quickly they couldn't even get a distress signal out. But in this case, we going back to that structure itself, we restored that across the years. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, so we raise the money as we go for either restorations or even just in the case of the motor lifeboat, which we just finished the restoration on that last year. That's 36381. That is a boat that we ended up, someone stepped forward, a donor stepped forward and paid for that boat for us to turn it into an exhibit, which is exactly what we've done. And then we had another group that ended up donating their time and essentially paid for all the permissions they needed to transport that boat from a place called Tall Timbers, Maryland, bringing it back to the UP and eventually Whitefish Point last fall, we ended up putting that building. So those are two recent physical restorations that we've done up at the Shipwreck Museum. And let's hit the next one here, Michelle. I'll start speeding through some of the museum related things here. Hit the next one as well. So new exhibits that we create. I mentioned the Daniel J. Morrell, 1966, that sank. We're covering up one of my favorite pictures here right now, unfortunately, of the exhibit itself. Can't show you that right now, but these are some of the surviving family members from the crew of the Daniel J. Morrell. Some of you may have seen programs that Dennis Hale did. Dennis was the sole survivor out of a crew of 29 from the Daniel J. Morrell, which broke up on Lake Huron and sank November 1966. Those family members came up. This was 2021, we had a dedication for the exhibit opening itself. Unfortunately, behind that image of the group there is a really good shot, and we'll be opening up that exhibit next year in the spring, and then a whole new exhibit dedicated to a ship called the A.A. Parker. That's been a bit of a long-term project, longer than we anticipated, but we should have it open next spring. Let's hit the next one here, Michelle. So the Weather Bureau building, that's where I'm actually speaking from right now. That's right next to the Sulaks Visitor Center. Built in 1899, one of the first U.S.-based weather stations, or at least Weather Bureau facilities on the Upper Great Lakes. You can see the image on the inside. We have exhibits there too. We interpret a little bit of that meteorology and weather reporting history. And it's interesting, if you read some of the reports from the weather observers and the meteorologists, I think they kind of have the general feeling that most of these ship captains, not all of them, but most of them would ignore the weather warnings that they put out, and they would just sail those ships right through the teeth of a storm. And, many of them, much like the crew in the Fitzgerald, had sailed through many storms in the past, and they figured they'd get through them again. Most of them did, but in many cases they didn't. And another reason why we have so many shipwrecks right in the area of Whitefish Point. So let's hit the next one. Next slide. So we're a relatively small organization. We are seasonal, like I said, open May through October. You can see some of these images here. We have people that work at Whitefish Point. We've got people like on the upper right, like my predecessor, Tom Farnquist, and to just beside him is a guy by the name of Jim Kelly. Between the two of them, they were really kind of the spearheads to make many of the exhibits that you see inside our main gallery, and we have our staff there. If anybody's ever curious or maybe would be interested in working at Whitefish Point, we do have some housing on site, so if that's something people would be interested in, reach out to me, because we'll be getting ready to start our hiring for 2025. We have a few volunteers. You can see on that very far right image, that's from mid-1990s, probably 1995, right before our keeper's quarters opened up in 1966. So some volunteer hours that went into the restoration of that structure as well. And let's hit the next one here, Michelle. So between the museum side of it, we have the marine operations. That, I think, is what is a little less known, even though we have different exhibit interpreter panels that will tell the story of our crew going out and looking for shipwrecks, and that is probably one of the more exciting things that we do as an organization. We can only do it for a few months across the summer. This last summer, the weather really didn't cooperate much at all, so we weren't really able to get the vessel out too much. The vessel we have, it's a retired U.S. Army Corps of Engineers research vessel called the David Boyd. It's just a little under 50 feet long. We use it to tow a sonar, and with that sonar, looks like a big torpedo, we can look out a half mile on each side, and it allows us to really kind of paint the bottom of the lake, if you want to put it that way, and see what's on the bottom. Let's hit the next one here, Michelle. We really have two primary crewmen, but there's a number of us, including myself, that will go out on the David Boyd when we're able to and when the weather cooperates. Let's hit the next one here, Michelle. And I'll show you a couple of images. Let's hit the next one here too. Very often we leave various ports. Grand Marais is a popular one for us to work out of. The DNR State of Michigan Harbor up at Whitefish Point, we work out of that one quite a bit too. There you can see Rick Mixter contemplating the meaning of life there as we're headed out to a target. Often, because the David Boyd is not not at all a fast vessel, it could take us sometimes as much as 3 and 4 hours to get out to a location where either we're going to start searching by deploying that sonar, or if we found another wreck, and kind of like we did with Barge 129, we have to put an ROV down on it. Let's hit the next one here, Michelle. So yeah, so a couple of these images you can see on the left there. We'll switch back from the ROV. You can see the ROV there, lower left-hand corner of the main picture. That's a Deep Ocean Engineering Phantom S4. This one's nearly 30 years old at this point, but we're still using it. We're looking to move on to a new one here pretty soon. Actually, we've been talking to Deep Ocean Engineering, and a much, much newer unit we're going to be working with next year from them. And hit the next one here, Michelle. So yeah, to put the sonar out, we have armored cable attached to that torpedo, if you want to call it that sonar unit. And we can put out over 1,000 feet of cable basically. And hit the next one, Michelle. There's kind of a diagram that kind of shows what this looks like. If you look at the image on the right there, you can see that torpedo-looking device and how it scans the bottom of the lake. Sonar, think in terms of sound waves. And what often happens is if there is a ship on the bottom of the lake, and you know what, more often than not, there's not. We can be out there for days at a time, weeks at a time, months at a time, not see anything. But we have had luck in the last 3 years. We did find another shipwreck this year. We've not announced it yet. It's a pretty important shipwreck for Lake Superior, actually for the Great Lakes, period. It was, I'm not going to give away too many clues here, but it was a revolutionary type of vessel. And it was also one that was really it was very shocking to the maritime community when it sank. We found that one probably in January. We're going to put the press release out on that one. But working with both Marine Sonic Technology out of Yorktown, Virginia, and then Deep Ocean Engineering as well, using their technology, we're able to locate these wrecks. Let's hit the next one, Michelle. And then once we find something, and usually what happens with this slide, I have an animation here where, in essence, when you bring the slide up first, you see the image on the left, and that's the only one you see. But then when we're able to adjust the frequency and we take another pass at something we found on the bottom of the lake, it may look something like you see on the right, which that is clearly a ship. Look at the shadow that it's casting off there. If we have a big shadow, that's a dead giveaway. But very often the image on the left is what you're seeing when we're first looking. And our director of marine operations, a man by the name of Daryl Ertel Jr., and his brother Dan Ertel, they are our primary crew. And between the two of them, and particularly Daryl, when it comes to interpreting the sonar imagery, we are able to find these wrecks. There is clearly an art and a science to doing this, and they both really have this down. Daryl's been looking for shipwrecks, searching for shipwrecks for the last 35 years, and so he really knows what he's doing. Let's hit the next slide here, Michelle. And you get a better image. This is the A.A. Parker that sank off Grand Marais in 1903. Kind of a little bit center right towards the top of the image, you can see the boilers from that ship, and you can see how the hull is kind of splayed out. Very kind of unusual. And that particular shipwreck is the basis of a new exhibit that we've been working on for a few years here that's going to open spring of 2025. So that's a little bit closer of a look. That's again the A.A. Parker, 1903 shipwreck. Let's hit the next one, Michelle. We'll start skipping through some of these a little more quickly. So once we find a wreck, we have to have very, very, very calm weather to deploy the ROV. And we get over the top of the wreck and under perfect conditions, which really didn't happen a lot this summer. 2021, it happened kind of a lot, and I think that helped us to find a lot of wrecks. But hit the next slide here. What ends up happening is we end up dropping a hook near the shipwreck, and at that point, with the perfect calm kind of weather, we deploy the ROV that you see right here. This is a much bigger crew of people than we would normally have. Usually it's only 3 or 4 of us that would be out there on the David Boyd. Even when we're deploying the Phantom S4 ROV, we might need more people to put that ROV down and operate that, because it takes a lot of people to not necessarily control it, but when we're deploying it and recovering it, that takes a bigger crew to do that. We have a crane, we have a winch, we bring it back in. But this is a film crew from Nat Geo. National Geographic did a program on one of the shipwrecks we found, the Selden E. Marvin. The Marvin was a essentially a schooner barge, and the whalebacks we'll be talking about here in a minute, both of those were barges that sank as well, but they were purpose-built whaleback barges. But Nat Geo came out and they filmed us as we were searching for wrecks and then as we were deploying the ROV. So it was a lot of fun working with them. And if you go on YouTube, if you put Nat Geo in and Great Lakes Shipwrecks, you should be able to find that if you've not seen that program. Let's hit the next slide here, Michelle. So once the ROV gets in the water, our Director of Marine Operations, Daryl Ortell, he's the one typically that is operating this ROV, and we swim it, or he'll swim it around on the surface for a few moments, and then it starts to descend. We do not use scuba divers on any of these wrecks at this point, as part of the reason being so many of the wrecks we've been finding in recent years are in they're quite deep, as much as 600 feet, 800 feet. That is even testing the depth capabilities of the ROV. Let's hit the next one, Michelle. There, so you can see Daryl, and he's working the controls of the ROV. Like I said, it's an older unit, so we'll have a little bit of adapting that we'll have to do this year with the new ROV coming in. But you can see the image on the right, the darker image there. That is our sonar that's on the ROV itself as it descends, and that allows us to get closer. And you know, sometimes there might be some challenges once you get on the bottom of the lake getting over to the shipwreck itself. I know that sounds kind of weird, but it's very dark down there, and the sonar helps us to get right down on top of it. You can see open hatch covers on that particular wreck as well. Let's hit the next one. Then when we get the ROV on the wreck, we can actually start seeing the wreck itself. So again, in lieu of putting scuba divers down, quite a bit more dangerous to put the divers down versus putting the ROV down. And you can start to see images like that. That's one of the turrets. That's actually on barge 129, we'll be talking about here in a few minutes. And it's pretty exciting. It really is. You know, it's exciting when we find them. I will say it can be kind of boring sometimes to be out on the lake for 10 or 12 hours and you don't see anything on the bottom of the lake, but it's still pretty exciting to be out on the lake, period, as opposed to being in our offices, you know, that kind of thing. But when you can actually, using the high intensity lighting that the ROV has and the high definition cameras, we can really get some pretty spectacular images. And in many cases, we are the first human eyes, even though it's through a camera on board the ROV, we're the first human eyes to see these vessels since they went to the bottom. And that is very exciting. Let's hit the next one here, Michelle. Yeah, this is another one. So I love clicking these images animated. What happens is it's like you're closing in, and I get a little closer with each image. But what you can see there on the image, you can actually see on the right, it's spelling out the name Atlanta. So the schooner Atlanta sank in 1891. We located that in 2021 as well. That one's about, I believe, about 25 odd miles northeast of Grand Marais. It was a purpose-built schooner barge that was being towed. It was relatively new when it sank. And let's hit the next slide here. My point in showing that one is you see how clearly that name Atlanta, you could see on the side on the name board. That's kind of, I wouldn't say it's unusual, but very often we have to do a lot of research, and particularly Daryl and his brother Dan and other researchers that work with the museum. We do a lot of research to study the imagery of the vessel we're looking at. We will know vessel should be, and I use the word should, I put that in italics if it was on paper. You know, certain vessels should be in certain areas. And the research helps with this. You know, we're not really going out willy-nilly looking for these wrecks. We'll set up grids, and within that grid, certain ships that went down, you know, that haven't been found yet, should be in a certain area. That doesn't mean that's where they're always located, and many times they're not. And we could be looking for one ship and we'll find another, and then, you know, you could be looking and looking and looking, and you just don't find the vessel at all. But those primary source materials, newspaper articles, eyewitness interviews from from the 1890s, from the early 1900s, where that newspaper reporter from, say, the Sioux Evening News just happens to know that survivors from a certain shipwreck are being brought, through the Sioux locks, or they might be on a ship coming through the locks that helped recover, some of the survivors from a wreck. That reporter would go and interview them as an example, and you've got that eyewitness account. We can dig through the local, the Bayless Library we have in the Sioux with their microfiche. You can go online and research newspapers, and you can find these different stories and these different eyewitness accounts of these shipwrecks. And that kind of research helps us to look in certain areas. It helps us to lay out a grid where a certain shipwreck might be. There's quite a few that are still hiding out there. There's 2 French minesweepers, sank in 1918. They were built for the French Navy, built out at Port Arthur, Fort William, out as what you would call Thunder Bay, Ontario today, that made their way across Lake Superior, and they never made it. There were a dozen of those minesweepers built. The last 3 sailed late November 1918. World War I was even over at that point, but you had 30 French sailors on each one, and they just vanished. They're still out there somewhere, and we've been looking for them, and we've even reached out and connected with the French Ministry of Underwater Archaeology, and there was a representative they had for years who just recently retired. He had kind of been, I wouldn't say our connection, but he was the one we connected with. But my point being, there's still a lot of ships that are still out there, and we're still looking for them. These are images you can see from the Atlanta. The center image you can see, center bottom there, that is a hand-operated pump that would pump water out of the hull. Great part of this story. The crew worked for 24 hours trying to keep water out of the hull of this, but the storm eventually overtook the ship. The steamship that was towing them had to move on. They couldn't wait, or they were going to sink as well. I'm giving you the Cliff Notes versions of some of these stories, but in the end, the crew was able to get in a lifeboat and crossed over 20 miles of storm-tossed Lake Superior to get within that shoreline, close to, I want to say it was the Chris Point Life-Saving Station. The lookout, the life-saving service lookout that was up in the watchtower, saw something in the water, but what he ended up seeing was an overturned lifeboat. They got that close, and there was only one survivor from the Atlanta that was able to tell that story. So you're seeing some underwater images right there. You can see part of the ship's wheel upper left, a capstan on the deck you can see below. There's one fantastic thing that we don't have in Lake Superior, and I say fantastic because it really is. We don't have the zebra mussels. We don't have the quagga mussels. So let's say if you go down and look at some of the shipwrecks that are, say, at the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, they're encrusted with these various mussels, and you really can't see the ship. We can still see paint on the deck. We are so lucky in that sense. We can see paint on the hull. We can see name boards. We can see paint on the decks that might be over 100 plus years old. And we can see all of these things you see in these images up close without seeing all those mussels all over them. Let's hit the next slide here, Michelle. We can see little bits of everyday life too, which to me, this is one of the more fascinating aspects of looking at these shipwrecks. You can see parts of the galley. You can see parts of a bathroom, the head that they would have used on board the ship, like you see here in this image. Let's hit the next one, Michelle. You can see other little bits of everyday life. This is from the schooner Frank Wheeler. That's another one we found in 2021. There's part of a big pot-bellied stove turned over. Look, there's a bench right up against it. There's a chair that's right next to it. There's some bunks in the background there. These were the living areas. This was the home for that crew that was on board the Frank Wheeler, and now we're able to see it. It sank in 1885, and here in 2022, when we got much of this imagery, we were able to get a closer look of what daily life might have, some of those elements of it. Let's hit the next one here, Michelle. A little closer image, at least we were able to see there. And then here's our Nat Geo crew and us again with the David Boyd. Let's hit the next one. They helped us to document parts of the Selden E. Marvin. But we're going to go ahead and shift gears here. So this program is about the whalebacks. There weren't that many whalebacks that were operating. Again, if I had all of you sitting in front of me, I would ask for a show of hands. How many have ever heard of whalebacks before? I've done programs for some of the different Michigan Recreation and Parks Association groups on Mackinac Island in recent weeks. And really, you could have a group of 50 people in front of you, and you might see 3 hands go up that they've heard of whalebacks. Whalebacks were not entirely unique to the Great Lakes, but they were very much a Great Lakes phenomenon and a type of vessel operating the lakes that were, for the most part, unique to the Great Lakes. The whalebacks were not considered the prettiest vessels. They were meant to be economically viable. It, there were only 44 of these that were ever built. Some information will tell us that there were 43. I've seen one source that indicates that there was one whaleback that was built in England, but these were all steel construction ships when there were many vessels operating that were wooden hull vessels. They had a number of technological features that might have been considered good at the time. But if you take a look at this is a steamship called the Pathfinder. This one's going to be important in one of the 2 stories, particularly the Sagamore that we're going to talk about. These vessels had a couple different features that made them very, very unique and many considered ugly compared to many of the ships that were operating in the day. They had steel hulls that were very long and narrow. They had flat bottoms, which allowed them to get in and out of some very shallow areas. Their hatch covers were flush with the deck, and the decks themselves, what you might call the weather deck, were flat on the top, but they were gently sloped on each side that allowed water to kind of roll off of them. This is where that nickname whaleback came from, because people would see, particularly the barges, when they were being towed, it almost looked like a whale. If you could see a whale in the water and the way that water is just rolling off the sides of a whale's back, that's how that nickname came to be. These were all built by the American Steel Barge Company out in West Superior. There were actually, I take that back, there were 1 or 2 that were built in Duluth, but Superior, Wisconsin is where the vast majority of these were built. And they had the unique feature of having, as opposed to standard cabins being built on them, they had turrets that would either have cabins or workspaces built on them. If you look at the Pathfinder in this picture, you look at the far right, you can see that turret on the front. You can see a couple crewmen standing on there. There's some vents there. There would be a capstan up there that might be used to bring up anchors, that type of thing. And then you look at the aft cabins that were built up on a turret as well. Some of the crew would be below deck. Much of the crew, at least for the Pathfinder, would have been in that cabin. And the aft built up on the deck, they tended to have their only life-saving equipment on board, which would be a yawl or like a small lifeboat. But the other interesting thing about these whalebacks too was the way the stern and the bow areas were almost conically shaped. So you think of a bow of a ship, more standard type of vessel, you think of them cutting through the water. Well, it wasn't really the case with these whalebacks. Let's hit the next slide, Michelle. These were more blunt, and they were really the brainchild of this man that you see right here. The bows were more blunt, and they almost, especially the bow, would look more like a snout, which was led to kind of an insult for these vessels. People would call them pig boats, which Alexander McDougall, the man you see in this picture, who was really, he was the inventor. It was in his brain that the idea of the whaleback came to fruition. He was a native of Scotland, born in 1845. His family immigrated to Canada in 1854. And by 1869, he became a United States citizen. And in those intervening years, from the time his family moved to Canada to him becoming a U.S. citizen, he was working on ships, everything going from a deckhand to a porter to a steward, and eventually getting up into the pilot house, eventually becoming a mate, first mate, and then eventually becoming a captain. And he was really an interesting guy. He was very much, how can I put this? He was an entrepreneur, if anything. He had no real engineering experience. He did have engineers and marine architects that would work with him that would help help see through the vision that he had for these whalebacks. I love this picture too. I mean, he doesn't look particularly happy there. I don't know if that's an invoice or something that he's got that he doesn't agree with or something, but But he eventually ended up moving to Duluth, and his shipyard, the American Steel Barge Company, the vast majority of those whalebacks ended up being built in what was called West Superior, Wisconsin. Let's hit the next one here, Michelle. He wasn't a fan of that nickname Pigboat at all. There on the right, you can see a cross section of the hull of what came to be known as Barge 101. Barge 101, you can see the photograph, built in 1888. This was the first of his whalebacks to be constructed. Many of them were simply barges. They had to be towed by steamships, and a number of them were also became steamships, whaleback steamships. But Barge 109 really exemplified the whaleback. You can see that is the bow. You're looking at that picture. You can see the turret built up there. Alexander McDougall actually patented, and he had a number of patents. He patented a type of triangular shaped anchor as well. This one has a more standard anchor on it. But you can see that bow and how it's very blunt, and you can see where that might almost look like a snout. Now imagine two holes in that blunt that would be anchor pockets, an anchor chain coming out, and the two holes almost made it look more like a nose. So this was the first one. It's 1888, as I said, it was built. It did okay, not great on its first test. The idea, to go back to the origination and what Alexander McDougall had in mind with these, was a more economical way. So the steel production for these vessels allowed these to be built a little bit more quickly. It allowed more cargo to be carried, a stronger material. And he thought, with his experience as a ship captain, that he could design something that could be towed more easily than some of the old schooners that had their masts cut down to become barges. So this was his idea that became reality with Barge 101 right there. Let's hit the next slide. You can see the turrets on it too. There you can see that image right there. I like to show that one. That's obviously the Sulaks. You can see the administrative building. I think, Michelle, your office is in there. You can probably see your window or something there. But at the you can see a combination here of a couple things going on. You can see a more standard steamship there headed downbound with Barge 130 being towed. It shows that differentiation between vessel type. And then you can see a couple of more modern steamships just about to enter the locks right there. Let's hit the next slide. I love some of these old images. This is an older view. It's harder for you to see probably. There's 3 whalebacks in that image. You can see that very blunt shaped bow. You can see the turrets on that whaleback steamship. The consort for that steamship or the vessel it's towing is right behind it in the lock, and then harder for you to see, but in the background there's another whaleback. These became very, very popular on the Great Lakes, to the point where I think people that didn't live on the lakes probably thought, through the media, through newspaper articles and imagery, that maybe whalebacks were the only kind of vessel that were actually operating on the Great Lakes. Obviously that was not true, but they tended to have a little more notoriety. The unique shape, design, and look of these vessels got some attention. Let's hit the next slide here, Michelle. Now, I love this shot too. So this is a good one. You're looking forward, and this is a whaleback steamship. You can very clearly see how flush the hatch covers are with that weather deck. You can see the sloping of the deck. This one is probably not. This one's running light. It's sitting up very high in the water. If it were fully loaded, it would be lower, and that water sometimes could be just rolling over the top of the vessel itself. And then in front of it there, just to the left, just to its port, you can see a whaleback steamship pulling 2 other whaleback barges. So having a steamship towing barges was you could haul more cargo, and these were very often bulk cargoes that we were talking about. That was what Alexander McDougall had in mind as well. Bulk cargoes. Think of modern ships hauling taconite pellets or hauling grain, hauling coal, limestone, what have you. That was much of what McDougall had in mind when Barge 101 hit the water in 1888. Iron ore wasn't quite as big of a deal. It was about to become a bigger deal, and it was natural for these whaleback steamships and barges to haul iron ore. And Very frequently, that was the case in the later years of the working life of these ships. Kind of a sidebar to these whalebacks. They didn't just sink on the Great Lakes. For those that did sink, many of the whaleback steamships ended up making their way out to the East Coast, where they ended up hauling coal, or in some cases they were converted over to hauling petroleum. And even a few of these whalebacks kind of they came to grief, met a not happy ending off the Gulf of Mexico as well. So these ships did make their way beyond the Great Lakes as well. Let's hit the next one, Michelle. Love this picture too. Really speaks of the era, but also look at the car, look at the bicycles, but look at that snout, that bow on board that whaleback. Kind of a unique mushroom-shaped anchor on that one, and that's got twin turrets on it there too, which was kind of unusual. Let's hit the next one. Okay, now, I said the media made a big deal of these. This is a postcard that we have in our collections at the museum. It says, "The passing of the tug, pigboat in tow." Kind of looks like the Wright brothers there, which is kind of funny in a way because they're pulling a steamship. But again, it kind of tells you how in the popular imagination, these whalebacks kind of took on a little bit of a life of their own. There you can see I mentioned twin turrets in that last image. You can see there's a pilot house turret and then more of a working cabin turret in front of that right up near the bow. Hit the next one, Michelle. And, other media, other articles could probably create confusion. Pig in distress at Copper Harbor. Well, that was Whaleback 131. You might think a farmer, some of his, pigs got out of their pen or something like that. But this was a newspaper headline referencing Whaleback Barge 131 having run aground off Copper Harbor in the Keweenaw Peninsula, and making a reference to wrecking tugs coming pulled off. So yeah, a theme that you're getting from me here is that there was some level of interest in the early years of these whaleback barges and their story. Let's hit the next one here. So, and there was only one whaleback passenger vessel, the Christopher Columbus, and not the prettiest, but some statistics show that it hauled as many or more passengers on board the Christopher Columbus than some of the more famous passenger vessels, like the Detroit and Cleveland steamship line vessels that used to run to places like Mackinac Island or the North American and South American. Apparently, the Christopher Columbus did haul many, many passengers, even though it wasn't the prettiest. But that was the only example of a whaleback passenger vessel. Let's hit the next one, Michelle. And then the last, built 1898, was named the Alexander McDougall. This vessel for the namesake of the inventor. Funny, almost ironically, this one has some different features to it as well. It's got a more standard bow on it, like a typical ship of the day would have. It has hatch combings, so the hatches themselves aren't flush like so many of the other whalebacks were. It's just a few differences with that one, but that one was the last that was built. Many of these whalebacks sailed right through World War II. It's interesting. I mean, they were stout vessels, but obviously a lot of them came to grief, and two of them we're going to be talking about. That's Duluth in the background, you can see there. And let's hit the next one. I know we're kind of speeding through these, but and we're hitting the last kind of chapter of the slides, if I could put it that way. Here's Sagamore right here. So this is the first shipwreck story. The Shipwreck Society, just to be clear, we did not locate the Sagamore. A couple of amateur divers found this one in the 1960s. This shows the Sagamore shortly after it was launched, and you can see this is a purpose-built barge. It had no propulsion of its own, so it absolutely had to have a tow cable, and it had to have a steamship. And often you would see the Sagamore with its tow vessel, a vessel called the Pathfinder. The other one I'm going to show you, or the other thing I want to point out, this aft turret. There, just behind that turret, you can see the only piece of life-saving equipment that it had. Look how high up that thing is. Imagine you're in a storm and you have to launch that lifeboat. It would not have been an easy process. And you could see those three rings just above the stern there. So again, that tapered, almost conically shaped stern and bow, very similar aft, and the again, the bow and the stern, I wouldn't say identical, but pretty close. You can see a little bit of a rudder, almost like a skeg, if you'd want to call it that. You see those three rings above where it says Sagamore. That's going to show up in some images here as we keep going on, some underwater images. Let's hit the next one here. I don't often like to have slides that have tons of writing in them, but this is just some basic information about the Sagamore. It's American Steel Barge Company that was registered in New York, but their work was happening in Superior, Wisconsin. It was hull number 122, launched July 1892, 320 feet long. Construction cost $97,500. 9 years of service. Interesting thing about the Sagamore and Barge 129, they were built within a year of each other, and they both sank as a result of collision a year from each other as well. So they had that in common. Let's hit the next one here. So like so many Great Lakes vessels being launched, it was like a sideways launch. This one, I would have used the animation. I had one as it was just about to be launched, and then you see this image right here. Any kind of a ship being launched is a big deal. Certainly is today, because there's hardly any ships being built on the Great Lakes at this point. But back then it was a big deal. Newspapers, reporters would come, a lot of photography, dignitaries would be there. Let's hit the next one. And there are just a couple more images you can see of the Sagamore. So it was very, very standard type of barge being built by the American Steel Barge Company. Very standard features as far as being a whaleback. Let's hit the next one. Okay, so there's Pathfinder. That's the steamship that would be very often paired with the Sagamore. And you can see, if you take a look, it's entering the Sulaks here. You can just see from the bow, those three rings that I told you about. In the center ring, there's nothing in it. That's where the tow line would go. This is a steamship, so that's interesting that they have that built in there. But they're anchor chains, and you can see those very unique triangular-shaped anchors there that were, if I recall, that was an invention, if I'm recalling correctly anyways, an invention of Alexander McDougall as well. Michelle's trying to get us closer in there. Let's go on to the next one here, Michelle. Don't worry about that too much. Oh, I think we skipped over one here. That's probably okay, though. It's just going to be another image. Yeah, another image of the Pathfinder going through the Sulaks. I love images like this. I don't know, Michelle, if I'm sure you have scads of photographs like this in the collections over there at the core. But look how close everybody is. Look at the style of dress. It kind of speaks of the era. There you can see the Constitution, another barge in the background there. More standard type of vessel, but they just give us some close-ups, kind of an interesting view of these ships. And you can see those hatch covers, again, very flush with the deck. So the Pathfinder would be paired with Sagamore. And let's start our story here. Hit the next slide, Michelle. They were coming from Duluth. So they were coming from the lakehead, headed towards the Sulaks. They had all of Lake Superior to cross. So you had Pathfinder pulling Sagamore. They're fully loaded with iron ore. Their destination is Cleveland. It's Friday. It's a sunny day, July 1901. Perfect weather as they're pulling out of Duluth. But a few hours into their trek across the lake, it starts to get very, very foggy, and they start running in dense fog. We still have a lot of fog up at Whitefish Point. That's nothing new. Let's hit the next slide. So they really traverse the whole of the lake in fog. And you can see that map there. It shows you the distance, over 300 miles that they're going to be covering, from heading from the west, heading in an easterly direction. They're headed downbound. Let's hit the next slide. By the time they were closing in on Whitefish Point, the captain of the Pathfinder, they were still in dense fog. You did have a crew on board Sagamore. You obviously had a crew on board the steamship Pathfinder. And by the time the captain on board the Pathfinder was getting off of Whitefish Point, they're still in dense fog. He's hearing that fog signal, so he starts adjusting his course accordingly to head into Whitefish Bay. Let's hit the next slide. And a few hours later, and again, it took them a couple days to get across the lake. They're getting down to the area of Iroquois Point, and they passed Isle Parisienne. And they're closing in on the upper St. Mary's River at this point, and the fog is so dense at that point that the captain on board the Pathfinder decides, you know what? We can hear a lot of foghorns. We can hear a lot of bells. Let's hit the next slide, Michelle. It's the smartest thing we can do right now. And they're just off Point Iroquois. You can see the Point Iroquois Lighthouse right here. just off of Point Iroquois. Let's hit the next slide. The captain on board the Pathfinder decides it's time to drop anchor. We need to wait till this fog clears up. That's a very, very logical decision. But there was a problem. The problem is, and let's hit the next slide, they just happen to be right in the middle of the upbound steamer track. And it was Monday morning, and they had gotten through the night. They could hear ships passing. But what ended up happening on Monday morning, after they had made this trip all the way across the lake, they and because because of the way these slides are compressed right now with the images, it put us ahead of where we should be, as far as this is showing you ultimately what was about to happen on that morning, that foggy morning. To backtrack a little bit, backpedal here, the captain on board the Pathfinder decided to have both vessels lashed together. And what ended up happening is, up at the bow of the Sagamore, there was a crewman, and his whole mission in life in that dense fog was there was a massive bell that was up there at the front, and he was to ring that bell. That was their fog signal between these two vessels. The captain of the Pathfinder did not want to have his fog horn going back by his stern turrets and cabins there, because his concern at that point was that you would have a ship that would think there were two vessels and there would be open water between that bow bell on board Sagamore and the aft cabin, aft section steam horn, steam whistle on board the Pathfinder. So ultimately what ended up happening was kind of definitely a tragedy, because there were two lives that were lost. But you had the Northern Queen. This is artwork by the name of, or artwork created by an artist by the name of Bob McGreevy. Much of the artwork we have in the museum up at Whitefish Point was created by him. And we try to, as a part of what we do, commission artists to draw up, paint some of these imagery that obviously no one was there to capture on film. We can try to imagine what it would have looked like when this vessel, in this case the Northern Queen, came up. They had just left the Sioux Locks a few hours before. They were headed upbound. They were eventually headed to Duluth as well, and it was full speed ahead. Now think about that for a minute. It's dense fog so thick that dozens of other vessels have decided to do the prudent thing and drop anchor. And here we've got Captain Vaughn, his name was, on board, captain of the Northern Queen. That's the vessel you see approaching Sagamore and Pathfinder. They're going full speed ahead. It's almost 12, 13 miles per hour, and they're headed up through that fog really fast. They're sounding their foghorn. The crewman on board Sagamore could hear them coming, and he was ringing his bell harder and faster to let them know, because they couldn't see. They could hear this ship coming. They couldn't see it until it was within, I want to say it was 300 or 400 feet, closing in on them full speed ahead. Can you imagine? Imagine the people on board Pathfinder, the crew on board Sagamore. There were the captain, a man by the name of Joyner, and the steward on board the Sagamore were both on the deck. They could see this vessel pop out of the fog, coming at them full steam ahead. As soon as they popped out of the fog, Captain Vaughn in the pilot house of the Northern Queen could see what was about to happen. He probably, well, who knows what was going through his mind at that moment. He ordered full reverse. Somehow that order was misunderstood, or somehow not noticed in the engine room, and they were still going full steam ahead when they eventually plowed into the Sagamore, almost cutting that vessel in half. Imagine this massive crash. Some of the crew of the Sagamore were below deck asleep. Others were in the Sagamore, or I'm sorry, the crew in the Sagamore, many of them were asleep below deck. Some in the Pathfinder doing the same thing. People knocked out of their bunks, knocked off their feet. And as I said, the hull of the Sagamore was nearly cut in two. What happened next is kind of inexplicable. Captain Vaughn ordered full reverse. That order was understood in the engine room, and it's full reverse. In some of these other instances that we have of collision with vessels, in many of the cases, the captain on the ship that might have hit the other one would try to keep full steam ahead in order to lock those vessels together and prevent the vessel that had been struck. If anything, it kind of locked them together to a degree, and water wasn't rushing in, and it would give the crew on the ship that was struck time to get off the ship and get onto the other vessel that had hit them. Many of the shipwrecks that we've researched that are represented inside the main gallery of the museum had instances like that, or other shipwrecks anyways that we've researched. Well, Captain Vaughn and the Northern Queen ordered full reverse. The Northern Queen pulled away from the Sagamore. Keep in mind the Sagamore was fully loaded with iron ore, and one reference says, or one account indicates that the Sagamore sank as quickly as in 90 seconds. Think about that, 90 seconds. The ship was that heavy, and it was cut that practically severed in half, and it sank that quickly. Disastrous results. The Northern Queen also did something else that was kind of inexplicable, and just pulled away from this sinking ship, went around the Sagamore and Pathfinder, and disappeared into the fog. No one understood what was going on. Why on earth did they not stick around? They did pick up, the crew of the Northern Queen did pick up one crew member that was in the water from the Sagamore, but they just kept going. Very strange. Let's hit the next slide here. And so this would be the headlines that followed. Marine disaster. The whaleback barge Sagamore sunk by the Northern Queen, cost 2 lives. So I mentioned Captain Joyner from the Sagamore and the steward. Those are the two that were actually on the deck of the Sagamore. They saw this coming, and almost strangely enough, they were the two fatalities. Let's hit the next one. More headlines that we'll see here. Captain Joyner's remains were found later. Let's hit the next one. And then not long after that, Ira Ives, the steward. It says ill-fated schooner. Well, it says schooner Sagamore. Well, not a schooner, but it's the same story, same vessel they were talking about. So let's hit the next one. We're kind of going to move through time a little bit here. 1960s now, 1963. The Sagamore is in relatively shallow water. If anybody ever watched that old show, Sea Hunt, I think it was, you could see these 1960s era scuba gear that they have on. Very shallow wreck. Let's hit the next one, and I'll show you a few underwater images that you can see of the Sagamore. Oh, and I don't want to forget the sonar imagery too. So there you can see with our side scan sonar with a pass, that's kind of an earlier side scan sonar images. You can see a bit of the hull. Some of it is lost in the shadow there, but hit the next one, and we can start to see some of the underwater imagery here. There, those 3 rings up at the front were the anchor chains, and the outer rings, and the tow rope hawser would go through that center ring. So we start to see some underwater imagery of the Sagamore. Let's hit the next one. A few more images. There you can see one of the turrets in the upper left. You can see inside the hull there, there's part of a ladder there and an opening, and you can just kind of get an idea. Kind of hard to tell some of the devastation of this ship, but the vessel obviously not only almost being cut in two, but as it hit the bottom, of the lake, to damage there as well. These photographs taken by Daryl Ertel Jr. I mentioned him before. He's our director of marine operations here at the Shipwreck Museum. And then Sarah Wildy also took some of these. They're both divers. They took some of these images. She's our operations manager at the museum. Let's hit the next slide here. Okay, we're our last set of slides here. I'm going to talk about Barge 129. Barge 129 had a lot in common with the Sagamore. Both the same type of vessel. They were built within a year of each other. Very, very similar features. You can see the hatches open there as it's being loaded up. Barge 129 is, to our understanding or our belief, the last of the whalebacks that hadn't been found that sank on the Great Lakes. This is one that Daryl Ertel, our director of marine operations, had been wanting to find for probably close to 25 years. So it was a pretty exciting time when we were pretty sure in late summer, or at least September 2021, that we had found this vessel. We didn't know it at that time, but it was in basically the right area. Let's hit the next slide here. So much like Sagamore, built in the same location. This one was hull number 129, launched May 13th, 1893, cargo capacity 3,300 tons, and construction cost of $75,660. 9 years of service before this one got in trouble on Lake Superior. Let's talk about how it got in trouble. Let's hit the next slide here. So this next slide shows it under construction. There's two whalebacks side by side there. Let's hit the next one, Michelle. Not many slides left. So if Pathfinder was the steamship that was towing Sagamore, the Mauna Loa, a little over 400 feet long, more of a standard steamship, was typically almost always the vessel you would see towing Barge 129. Mauna Loa was a pretty new ship, and the captain on board, man by the name of, actually Bailey was captain of the Barge 129. I'm forgetting off the top of my head the name of the captain's name from the Mauna Loa. But let's hit the next one here. Very, very different circumstances behind the sinking, although it was a collision. We're just going to jump right to it here. This is more artwork by Bob McGreevy. These vessels left Duluth fully loaded with iron ore, much like Pathfinder and Sagamore were. They were hauling across Lake Superior when the weather, in October, not unusual to have some dramatic weather. When the storm started to get worse, eventually the tow line that I referenced, about 1,000 feet long between Mauna Loa and Barge 129, that tow line snapped. This was kind of a precursor to shipwreck for many of these barges. Once that tow line snapped, and if the storm was bad enough for the vessel towing the barge, if it was bad enough that the steamship couldn't turn around without endangering themselves, very often that barge, or in some cases schooner barges, would be kind of left to their own devices. The difference between a whaleback barge and the schooner barges was the schooner barges still had masts, they still had sails. They could try to raise sail and they could try to control their own fate to a certain degree. But the captain on board the Mauna Loa knew that the crew on board Barge 129 and Captain Bailey, who was the captain on board the whaleback barge, keep in mind these barges, they did have their own crew because they did have to handle the vessel. They would be the ones loading it. They would be the ones, if they had that real capability of steering it, or if it was a schooner barge with sails, these barges still have their own crew. The captain on board the Mauna Loa knew that if he didn't turn around, they would probably be in the next few days reading about the disappearance and demise of the crew from Barge 129. So he made the difficult decision, but the right one, to turn his vessel around. So this was a snowstorm, massive waves, high winds, very, very dramatic situation. By turning the Mauna Loa around, he was putting his own ship in danger because they could get caught in the trough of the waves. That could be known to sink a ship right there, that situation. But fortunately, the captain of the Mauna Loa and his crew, they were able to turn their steamship around. It took them about an hour. At times, they were losing visibility of Barge 129 through snowstorms, snow squalls. It took them about an hour. And the idea was that he would come up behind Barge 129 with his port side, and he would get close enough to the vessel that his stern would be up close to the starboard side bow, or just right up at the bow of Barge 129, and they could try to reconnect that tow line. But what ended up happening was, as they were closing that gap, and his port side closing in on the starboard side of Barge 129, a massive wave pushed the two vessels together, and the port side anchor from Mauna Loa smashed up against the side of the hull of Barge 129, stoving in, smashing in those hull plates, and now suddenly we have Lake Superior pouring into Barge 129. It wasn't as dramatic of a collision, anywhere near as dramatic of a collision as the Northern Queen and Sagamore. So now this is the image you see that Bob McGreevy was creating to try to show us maybe what it would have looked like when the crew and the captain of Barge 129 are trying to launch their lifeboat, that yawl. We looked at that image of Sagamore, and they're trying to launch this. They were able to do it in those. I mean, he gives a good image, Bob does, of what the waves might have looked like. I mean, you might think this is almost suicide to get into a small open boat, but eventually they were able to launch it, and they were able to get over to Mauna Loa. Let's show the next slide here, Michelle. So we've got a couple of parts of newspaper articles here, and it's interesting. People will often complain about the media today, maybe not always getting the story completely right. Well, it really wasn't that much different back then, too. If you take a look at this section of an article in a newspaper, it states Whaleback barge 119, should be 129, was sunk in collision with her consort, the steamer Mauna Loa, on Lake Superior at 125 feet of water. That vessel, they wouldn't have known it at the time, but that vessel's in over 600 feet of water. But it went on to say the collision was a result of an attempt to regain the control of the barge after departing the tow line. Captain Joshua Bailey, and his name was actually Josiah, but Joshua Bailey was commander of Barge 129. The barge belonged to the Steel Corporation. It was valued at $60,000. No lives were lost. Let's hit the next one here. This next one is actually kind of funny in a way. It tells some of the same story. And it talks about Captain Bailey when they were launching the yawl. It states that Captain Bailey succeeded in getting their lifeboat in the water. By the time the crew reached him, they had to go through the vessel beneath the deck. One by one, the crew went on board the small boat until all had left the barge. The last man was unfortunate enough to miss and jump into the water. He was rescued. The bow of the yawl was stove in, and one of the men held a coat over the break while the others bailed and rowed the boat backward until the steamer was reached. Number 129 sunk at about 5 minutes. After the crew reached safety, the captain and crew of 8 men have received reimbursement for their clothing and other property lost. I think in the end, they were probably just very, very happy to be alive. But getting reimbursed for their clothing and their property, that wasn't a bad thing probably either. Let's hit the next slide here, Michelle. Last few slides here. Summer 2022, we found Barge 129 in late summer 2021, like you heard me say a couple times. We're searching many early mornings departing Grand Marais or Whitefish Point Harbor. Let's hit the next slide. Towing sonar. When we were able to finally go out in 2022 and tow sonar over, this was some of the imagery that we started to see at Barge 129. So you can see a broken hull. You look in the right section, you can see part of a turret. That would have been the aft turret. Let's see the next slide here, Michelle. Now, you take a look at that left sonar image. Not the greatest sonar image. It's a little bit of distortion, but you could just make out a part of the bow area, right almost the center right of that sonar image. You can see a little bit of that turret there on there. We really started to know, and this was more Daryl or Tell starting to really figure this out, what we were seeing. Let's see the next slide here, Michelle. Last couple slides there, you can see a little bit more of a close-up showing that stubby kind of snout-like bow broken off there. And let's hit the next slide. We show a few more underwater images launching the ROV on that one. Let's hit the next slide, Michelle. There, we can see that bow area, and you can see part of that tow line, that hawser going through that center ring. You can see the anchor chains on the outer rings there. Hit the next slide. There you can see a porthole in one of the turrets. Look at that big, heavy rope. Again, the hawser, the tow line, which played such a role in this vessel, ended up getting separated from the Mauna Loa. Let's hit the next slide. Okay, a couple more images. Some of these you've seen already. This is up on the bow turret area. There's a capstan. That hawser is wrapped all over the place. Let's hit the next slide. And there you can see more of a close-up. So this would have been a series of images that through an animation, I would have shown each one popping up. That white line you see in the center there, that is part of our tether for the ROV. That's kind of scary when that thing's visible. It's not where it should be. Sometimes there's concerns with the ROV getting hung up, especially some of the sailing vessels where there's rigging and masts and such things. And I will say, as interesting, this is kind of my own opinion I'm interjecting here, but I think some of us at the museum share the same opinion, that is interesting as Barge 129 and some of the steel-hauled vessels we've located are to look at. It's far more interesting to look at some of these schooners and just some of the features of these vessels, very graceful lines that they have, the cabins they have on deck, the masts, the rigging, everything else. Some of that's kind of scary, but they just tend to be more interesting to look at underwater. Let's hit the next slide. Another view showing a capstan on that bow turret. Let's hit one more. And then one of the last couple slides I'll show. So Barge 129 in all of its glory there shortly after it was built. That is in a little over 600 feet of water on the bottom of Lake Superior at this point. Let's hit the next slide. And here, one of my last two slides. So if any of you are interested and want to learn more about these whalebacks, there's some good reading material that I can recommend. One of the better ones that I found that really summarizes the dispositions, particularly of the whalebacks that sank, is Whalebacks Wrecked, Scrapped, Lost, and Forgotten by Neil R. Zoss. That is a great source. A little more in-depth of the actual building of these vessels would be Whaleback Ships and the American Steel Barge Company by C. Roger Pellet. That's a good book too. Ghost Ships, Gales, and Forgotten Tales by Wes Olszewski. I'm probably butchering his last name, but I think that's how that's pronounced. That's got a few stories about whalebacks. Many of you are probably familiar with Larry Massey. Larry has put out a lot of books on Michigan history, and his Pig Boats and River Hogs, Further Voyages into Michigan's Past, well, that reference to pig boats, that's about whalebacks. And he has a few stories about whalebacks as well. In Lake Superior Shipwreck Coast by Fred Stonehouse. That is a book, that's one we issue to all of our staff. We give them each a copy. Has pretty much, I wouldn't say, well, not nearly all shipwrecks in the vicinity of Whitefish Point and the Shipwreck Coast, but it has a great number of shipwreck stories related to ships that foundered, sank as a result of collision or what have you in the area of Whitefish Point and the Shipwreck Coast by Fred Stonehouse. He's also got sections on the life-saving service, Lighthouse service, and even the Edmund Fitzgerald in that book. So that's a good one too. And you can read about Sagamore. You can read about Barge 129 in that book as well. So that is my penultimate slide, the last one. If you hit the next one, if you want to learn more about what we do as a museum, and we referenced earlier, if you want to watch the memorial event that we'll be doing on Sunday night for the Fitzgerald, you can go on shipwreckmuseum.com, and we'll eventually, we don't have it up yet, but eventually we'll be posting that link. So with that, thank you everybody for joining us here today. And Michelle looks like she's ready to jump in.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm going to give people a few minutes to enter their questions into the chat, and I can pass those questions along. Meanwhile, I'm going to just cover the status of our visitor centers in Sault Ste. Marie and in Duluth. In Duluth, they are closed on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, but they're open the rest of the week. You see their hours right there. They have a cell phone tour available outdoors. It's a self-guided tour. And they have a video online tour of their visitor center. Here at the Soo Locks, or I should say there at the Soo Locks, because I'm in Toronto. At the Soo Locks, we closed on October 31st for the season. We'll be reopening on May 1st. We'll have our special open house in March. We'll have more about that when we're getting a little closer to it. And the park is on its winter hours now from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And we'll have the platform open until we start getting freezing weather conditions because the ice makes it crazy dangerous. I'm going to do a quick plug while I have a captive audience before we get to the questions. Just that next program we're doing next month about the Great Lakes Maritime Academy. That should be a really cool program, learning about the program they have training the next generation of mariners for the Great Lakes. It's a really rewarding and lucrative career for many of the people, and Trish Meyer from the Academy will be here next month to tell us all about it. And while we give people just a chance to, and Ranger Scott is dropping some of the links into the chat for our next virtual visitor center program. I'm going to ask Scott if he can also drop in the links to our YouTube channel, which is where we post all of the virtual visitor center programs. If you enjoyed this program from Bruce, and I know I certainly did, and you would like to share it, we'll have that video posted probably early next week, because I am traveling today and tomorrow, and we have a holiday coming up, but I will be getting it posted to that YouTube channel early in the week. And I just had a couple observations I was going to make, Bruce, and you kind of alluded to it in some of those photos you showed of like their living areas and just the everyday life, that this was their home. And it's kind of neat when you think about that these shipwrecks are really like they froze in time. Probably the worst day in these people's lives or their last day. And it's frozen in time. The plates that were there, the chairs that were there, the tools they were using, all of that.
It's absolutely true. Yeah, and you just mentioned plates. A lot of the other shipwrecks we found, you'll find china all over the place. You'll find coffee pots. You'll find shovels. Like I said, oddly enough, there were a couple where you could see toilets, which you were almost kind of surprised that they were almost that modern looking on some of those ships from back in the day. But yeah, there's one shipwreck that we found where you can look right into the cabin. You can see bunks in there. The bunks are still in place. There was one where there were a couple wheelbarrows that were, right next to the hull of the ship. Pretty cool stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty exciting. Pretty exciting part of what we do, I guess.
And then a question that I had, and I never really thought about it before, but how many crew members would be on one of these barges? I always just thought of it as a dead weight they were towing. And I guess I presume there must be people on it to do something.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they would be on board if they had to drop anchor, if they, when they were unloading, loading, maintenance on the ship. They still needed a minimal crew. It depends on the ship. That's a good question, Michelle, because I've seen references to as few as like 6 crewmen on board some of these ships. Some of them you might see a reference to 9 or 10. But somewhere, I guess, in that ballpark would be the number. You wouldn't have a need quite as much as the actual steamship to have that many crew. But yeah, somewhere in that ballpark.
And that just astonishes me with the Sagamore, like going through, just continuing to navigate and just figure, oh, I'll just ring my bell during this heavy fog that I can't see anything. And, I just took me a minute to kind of think about, they didn't have AIS. They didn't have radar. All they had is what you can see and hear. And that's just astonishing that they would just keep going through it and had that kind of confidence in what they hear.
Well, I don't know how much of a choice. I mean, it's a good point, but I'm not really sure how much of an option they had because the captain on board the Pathfinder knew he could hear a lot going on around it. At least if the different sources we've read and a couple of these secondary materials, he had a general idea where he was. I think the more surprising part of that story was the captain of the Northern Queen going full speed ahead and
Yeah,
not
that's crazy.
yeah, and then just disappearing afterwards. I would like to follow up and research. I know there are records that talk about after, a shipwreck, there would be an investigation. I'd like to find out what happened to Captain Vaughn. I'm sure. One article I read said that he was held responsible, but it didn't say what the penalty was, and 2 people
Okay.
obviously died. So
Right.
I would imagine his master's license would have been, one would think, revoked for a period of time. But yeah, he would have had to have been the one held responsible for that. I can't imagine the captain of the Pathfinder, because he's the one that chose to drop anchor. But I think everybody knows that if you're in dense fog like that, that's possibly could happen. You're not going to be able to get an exact fix on your location.
Right. And you're not supposed to be operating at full speed either.
Correct. That's right.
Kind of like on the highways, you have to do a speed that's prudent. And I know in the Sioux, I've been through some of that thick fog where you can see 100 feet ahead of you, and you can't just keep driving, 75 miles an hour down the interstate.
Exactly.
I mean, it was basically a hit and run.
That's right. That's exactly what it was.
And then I just made you'd asked about the photos we have of the locks. And we have about 1,700 glass plate negatives that span between 1865 and 1940. So it's a pretty amazing collection. And I was having a fun time identifying the time frames for all the different photos at the locks you were showing, because it's a fun little mystery and puzzle to me. And I'm not seeing any questions. So I think you have answered all the questions.
Well, that's great because I needed to be kind of rounding it out by 2 anyways. We're prepping for this Fitzgerald ceremony, so there's a couple things I have to do. But if there aren't any questions, I guess if anybody does have any questions, if they think about them afterwards, um, take a look at our website. Our contact information is there for the museum. Again, that's shipwreckmuseum.com. Don't hesitate to reach out. But in any case, thank you, Michelle, and thank you,
And
everybody.
Bruce, we had a comment from Chris. I'm not going to try to say the last name. And he said Brendan Ballard should be able to assist with the court document side.
Ah, good. Okay.
So
Yeah, if you didn't, I'll
go
jump
ahead.
in there. I forgot I can talk. Yeah, Brendan's working on a project there. He didn't create it, but there is an amazing database that he's come into possession with and is now orchestrating, um, facilitating how to get it out. But I've been using it quite a bit. It is amazing, the documentation, because what it allows you then is to, research a vessel's gone missing. Here's what happened. Here's, people. So it's pretty interesting, but definitely reach out to him because, like I say, he'll be your quickest. I assume you know who I'm referring to there with
I
the
do. Yeah.
yeah,
I
perfect. Yeah, well, I figured as much. So not a
Brendan's a
problem.
great guy. And you're absolutely right. I have no doubts. And if he didn't have it himself, I'm sure he could steer us. But I think I was at the National Archives in Chicago a few years ago, or before the pandemic, anyways. And I think they do have, and this would be a question, or at least, Brendan might be able to answer this too. I believe that the records of those investigations after a shipwreck are in the National Archives in Chicago, and that would be another place for anybody really in this
Yeah.
group. Your research.
Yeah, correct. And I forget the gentleman's name that's done it, but he has gone through and organized it in a way that you can reference by date, you can reference by this way. So it's made the research side far easier for us now. And so it is a great database. It's not perfect yet, but it's definitely getting there. I'm helping Brendan on that side too a bit. And so we'll go from there. Well, I appreciate your time, and if you see Corey, tell him I'm hunting him down.
I will, Chris. Thank you for
Not a
joining
problem.
us. Thanks for
I
the
appreciate your time.
reminder, Brendan, too.
For everybody still with us, I just dropped a link to the page on the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society's website about that Edmund Fitzgerald Memorial Ceremony, and they will be getting a link added to their website later in the week for everybody who would like to watch that ceremony. I watched it a few years ago. It's very moving and well done, and it's something to look forward to. And I have my one last slide here. For anybody still with us, we have a survey. If anyone can fill that out, we are always happy to get suggestions for future programs. We have a pretty good lineup, but we're always looking for new ideas and all the different ways that you can get a hold of us. And Bruce, thank you again for agreeing to help us out here with the Virtual Visitor Center. You're one of my favorite guests. And this was a really great program.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I appreciate the invitation, and it's fun to be able to exhibit a little bit about the museum, tell about what we do, and I appreciate everybody tuning in here today.
And thank you, and goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.